It's the little details that are vital. Little things make big things happen. John Wooden. Hi there, welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. This is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but actually have the confidence because you've done the work to lean in and rock retirement, hopefully even in a bear market. Now, today we're going to answer some of your questions, and we're going to have our new Bring It On segment where we talk about the non-financial aspect of retirement. Before we do that, though, I want to share some of my observations from the recently aired Retirement Plan Live series with Rosie and Dwayne. We just had the results webinar with Rosie where we actually looked at the results of where they're at right now, and it wasn't feasible. And so we had to navigate that, and I want to thank Rosie so much for stepping up and sharing a somewhat difficult situation so publicly, and we're going to work to help her out, but for us to learn as we walk this journey with her. So thank you so much, Rosie. So my observations from that journey with Rosie, and if you didn't watch the results webinar, it is at rogerwhitney.com under free resources. You can find it there. Essentially, when we did the analysis with this bear market, it was clear that the plan that they had, which is relatively close to the plan that they have been working, is nowhere near feasible. And if they continued on that trajectory, it looked like they were going to run out of money within the next 10 years. So it was a difficult one to navigate, especially live with Rosie and 1,000 plus people. And I think we framed a way to get back on track. So that's the short of it, but you can see the replay at our website. Here are my observations from my interactions with Rosie and what I've heard, and I'm thinking about it a lot. Now, I haven't had a lot of extended interactions beyond what you heard on the show. Rosie and I had a few conversations outside of the show, but not a lot. And I'm coming into this with fresh eyes. So I want to acknowledge that perspective. But here are some observations I have that I think we need to all be aware of in our own journeys. Number one, when Rosie retired in mid-2021, it was a bull market. Interest rates were zero. And their plan, I assume, was somewhat feasible when they retired because they're working with an advisor and they said that they saw projections. When I step back and look at it, I don't know how it was feasible even before the bear market with the kind of withdrawal rate they were taking, but we'll leave that. Even if it was feasible, though, it's clear that nothing was done to make it resilient, which is that third stage of a good retirement plan. You have a vision, you have making a feasible plan, then you got to make it resilient so it can handle shocks, whether that's life event shocks or a bear market shock. So it's clear that the plan never became a resilient plan. So when life happened, in this case, a bear market, the plan broke pretty quickly. And now they're dealing with a plan that isn't close to feasible and having to really make some tough decisions as a result of that. Now, would the plan broken anyway, given that we had this bear market? Possibly, but I don't think it would have been near as big of a renegotiation as they're likely facing. So that's my first observation, is that they had a feasible plan statistically, looking at models. I don't get how that worked actually, but I'm assuming that that's what happened. They said they had numbers with their advisor that said it was feasible. Well, it wasn't resilient, so that feasibility was very weak, and it didn't take much to blow it over. One analogy to think about this between the difference between feasible and resilient, a feasible plan is like a lit candle. The candle can burn, but if you have a good breeze come by, it's going to blow that candle out. When you make a plan resilient, it's like a fire. It has some substance to it. So when a breeze comes by, it's definitely not going to blow it out, and it may actually fuel it and make the overall plan stronger. Now, that's not a perfect metaphor, but hopefully gets the point home. So that's observation number one. Observation number two, going into their plan or into retirement, as well as currently, they're about 75% equities in their overall allocation. And given the constraint of their plan, meaning that they weren't vastly overfunded, they were barely feasible, if that. they continued with an accumulation investment stance, even though they had started doing systematic withdrawals on a monthly basis, reverse dollar cost averaging. In mid-2021, it was probably hard to get much more conservative in terms of having an investment plan that matched the withdrawals they were going to do because interest rates were zero and the markets were doing relatively good. So it would have been having to pivot when the party was still going on. But this accumulation, meaning fairly equity heavy investment allocation, didn't serve them when they were drawing money out when sequence of return risk was the highest. And that is really unfortunate, especially given that they're not overfunded. They were barely funded and now they're underfunded for what their plan has been. And that's an example of going from, retiring and going from an accumulation to a decumulation investment stance. You got to make that transition to secure the outcomes you want in this harvest season of life. And so that's unfortunate. My third observation is related to that, is that they were using a financial planner, a CFP, this entire time. And I don't know the conversations they had with this planner over this entire time. I don't know the process that was used, but it becomes much more clear to me seeing how things were done that there is a big difference between a financial advisor and even a financial planner and a retirement planner, somebody who goes deep on how do you actually build and manage a decumulation plan that has some resilience to it. I think financial planning is a whole different category. If you think of financial planner, certified financial planner, that's like your general practitioner, say in medical. You're not going to have them do the surgery. You're not going to have them do the specialties because they're a general practitioner. I'm convicted more and more that a specialist that focuses on true retirement planning that is product and investment neutral is very different than a general financial planner. And I think we see that in this case. One, because from my understanding is they had this accumulation mindset in terms of the investment allocation, and they were literally selling assets every single month from the asset allocation to meet the withdrawals. And that simply does not work for somebody who is very constrained or on the edge of being a feasible plan. It doesn't work. Third observation, I think it's the third or fourth observation, is it was obvious that there were communication issues between the advisor and Rosie and her husband. Rosie articulated that she assumed that there was safe money there for the distributions. And in her mind, she said, safe money meant money markets, CDs, etc. And in a recent meeting with the advisor, she shared that, in fact, the advisor heard safe investments and had that simply in the bond portion of the allocation. So it was in bond funds or ETFs rather than in liquid assets like cash, CDs, etc. That was not Rosie's understanding. And this incongruence between what she thought and what the advisor thought, this tomato situation, went on for over a year and was recently discovered. So there was obviously some miscommunication here on the advisor part for not showing in detail exactly how this was going to happen, potentially. And I'm wary of knowing what the advisor did and criticizing the advisor because I don't know what the conversations were had. But it's clear that Rosie had a different understanding and she didn't dig deep enough, most likely, in looking at the statements and in their conversations to tease out the fact that there was some miscommunication going on. And both parties can be at fault there. And in what Rosie shared on the show and on the results show is she would ask questions and then the advisor would answer them, but on a surface level. And then Rosie either didn't know the question or didn't have a follow-up question to pin it down deeper. The little details are vital, especially on the important topics, because that's how big things happen. And this little detail of exactly how the decumulation plan was going from the investment fund to create their paycheck, that detail was missing. It was low resolution for Rosie as to how it was going to go. And that's a problem. And my last observation I'll share for now is that Rosie took her Social Security early. Dwayne just started his Social Security, so there might actually be an option there to undo that. But in her she articulated, I think it was in the third episode of that series, that she and Dwayne were determined to take their Social Security early to preserve their assets for as long as they could. And that the advisor and Rosie and Dwayne had surface level discussions, but never actually looked at it in an organized way in depth because they had already made that decision before going to the advisor. And in their situation, this is a decision that is material to the long-term feasibility of this plan. Given that they were so constrained at the beginning of retirement, maximizing that social capital of maximizing Social Security, even if they went through their assets, could have made a significant difference in the trajectory of their plan, even if they had to tap their assets early. At a minimum, it should have been analyzed more in detail. So even if they chose to take it early, it was done with eyes wide open. That was a rough one to go through. I appreciate Rosie, and they're working on the decisions to get back on track. But with that, let's move on and answer some of your questions. I like answering your questions. We're going to do that today. So if you have a question for the show, go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger, or click on the link in our 6-Shot Saturday email. That will take you right to the site where you can type in a question, or you can leave an audio question so we can hear your awesome voice. All right, our first question today comes from Scott related to deferred compensation. He has a deferred compensation plan. And before we get to his question, let's define what that is. This is a compensation scheme developed by companies where it allows an employee to defer their income in this deferred compensation plan, and then it would be invested in some way, and then it would be paid out on some schedule at some later date, typically retirement. Each plan is structured differently. Some plans you have to choose when you're deferring your income in the year that you make that deferral. Sometimes there's some flexibility there. So as an example, let's say you're 40 years old and you make $200,000. You can say, defer $100,000 of my income and pay it out to me when I'm 65. And then that money would grow and then be paid out at 65. And each plan is a little bit different. So there isn't just some standard plan everybody has. So Scott's question is deferred compensation considered earned income during the distribution period? I'm asking for the intent of Roth conversion after retirement or for Roth contributions of excess money. So what Scott's trying to figure out is, how is this deferred income treated when it's actually paid out? Because he wants to consider doing some Roth conversions or perhaps contributing to Roths because he's going to get this income. What's the treatment of that income from a deferred compensation plan? So Scott, unfortunately, deferred compensation payouts is not an eligible type of income to allow you to make Roth conversions. Other types of incomes are non-IRA contribution eligible as well. Pension income, annuity income, property earnings and profits, and certain types of profit income as well don't count as income in order to actually make a Roth contribution in this case. And I would refer you to the IRS publication 590A, where it talks about this. Now, if you're going to have deferred income payouts or deferred comp payouts in retirement, you could use those payouts that you're going to pay taxes on because it's earned income and from a federal tax bracket standpoint to defray the cost of perhaps doing Roth conversions of other IRA assets instead. But unfortunately, it's not going to count as income to allow you to make a contribution to a Roth IRA. Our next question comes from Scott related to Social Security. Scott says, I have a 58-year-old friend whose husband died last year at age 63. He was the primary earner. I don't know all the details about her finances, but based on my conversation with her, I assume she could really use the monthly income. When can she start collecting Social Security? Am I right that I'm assuming that it's based on his contributions? Okay, Scott, thanks for helping her out on this, by the way. The earliest your friend can receive Social Security based on her survivor benefit isn't until age 60. Now, if she had enough earnings on her own record, that would be 62. But given her birth year, if she does turn on her survivor's benefit at the minimum age of 60, she would get about 70% of what the potential survivor benefit would be based off of her husband's record. Delaying until age 62 would get her about 80% of the full survivor benefit, and then waiting until age 67, her full retirement age, would be the highest benefit she could get. Unfortunately, there is no benefit for her delaying out to age 70 if she's claiming on as a surviving spouse on that benefit. But given her age, that's about 9 years until she could get the maximum survivor benefit. And unfortunately, when you have a spouse pass, your expenses don't go down by half. They may go down a bit, but sometimes it could actually increase because you have new expenses for other things. And by the way, we're going to be exploring going from 2 to 1 next month. That's going to be the theme for the entire month. And we're going to have some organized thinking around navigating these types of decisions, including the survivor benefit for Social Security. What she needs to have to help make that decision is a feasible plan of how this is going to work. Because right now she's focused on, the way you stated anyway, the here and now of, hey, getting this benefit at age 60 could really help right now. And what she needs to understand better between now and when she makes that decision is, does taking that bird in the hand right now potentially hurt me later in life in terms of having guaranteed income that will increase by inflation? And the only way she's going to find that out is by putting together a framework for not just how she's going to pay her bills this year, next year, and the year after, but how she's going to cover her expenses into older age. And everything should be on the table, whether it's part-time work, relocation, adjusting expenses. Everything should be on the table so she can start to look at her new situation, her unexpected situation with fresh eyes. And we're going to talk a lot about that in an organized way. So maybe suggest that she tune into that for March's series on going from 2 to 1. Our next question comes from Michael relative to creating the pie cake in this pathway for how to pay for life. So let's check out Michael's question.
Hey, Roger, this is Michael. My question's about the pie cake and the 5-year short-term fund. You may have already addressed my question, but I haven't heard it yet as a relatively new listener, although I've gone back to a lot of older podcasts to try to find it. But here it goes. So my retirement pie cake consists of a tax-diverse collection of stocks and bonds and a 60-40 mix. Having a 5-year cash fund permanently lowers returns over the course of a long retirement. Since the stock market is much more often up than down any 1 year, and since I have to replenish the 5-year fund each year by selling assets anyway, doesn't this just create a stagnant pool of sidelined wealth that would more likely be earning a better return elsewhere? If I run my numbers for retirement and include 5 years of living expenses as not invested, that means I either need a larger pie cake at retirement to make it work, or I will need to live a more modest life than if, say, I only had 1 to 2 years set aside for cash. Or do I let the 5-year fund dwindle down in a bad market and wait to replenish it when the market gets better? If so, isn't that just another way of trying to time the market? Ultimately, is the 5-year fund really a behavioral buffer because we humans are very loss-averse and prone to making bad decisions? If I'm confident in my ability to act rationally in a declining market, or even have the option of going back to work part-time if things really go south, will I be okay with a much smaller short-term fund than 5 years? Thanks for all you do, Roger, and for addressing my many questions within a question.
Hey, Michael. Yes, many questions in a question, but great questions, all of them. So let's try to unpack this a little bit. So first off, the exercise of creating the pie cake and mapping out how you're going to pay for the first 5 years of life is after you know you have a feasible plan. So when you have a feasible plan of record, which is stage 2, you go from vision stage 1, feasible plan of record stage 2. So you know that, hey, mathematically this should work, whether you're using Monte Carlo scenarios or what your spreadsheets or what have you. The third stage is making the plan resilient, meaning that, okay, it's feasible mathematically, but we know that a lot can happen. Life can smack us in the face, as we just heard with the last question. Markets can smack us in the face as we just are going through a bear market. Inflation can smack us in the face and rise much higher than what historical norms are. And all of those can work together in some instances and just give us this really toxic mix. As a result of all of this uncertainty, it's important to have slack in the system, meaning liquidity, so we have pieces that we can move around and make adjustments so we can navigate that. And if we have almost no cash reserves, or maybe only a year or two, and then the rest of it is invested with risk assets, volatile assets, it lessens our optionality and the ability to make adjustments because we're running a more optimized, from a return standpoint, system. One of the problems with trying to optimize the return flow, the potential returns, is that you make it more rigid. You make it more brittle to breaking when this toxic mix enters the system of bad markets, inflation, etc. So 5 years I use as the baseline. We have to have a baseline to start from. So the way you're going to determine how much of a buffer you need or income floor you need is going to be based on your fundedness ratio in terms of how feasible the plan is. If it's very clear that you are overfunded, meaning you have excess wealth, more wealth than you really need to fund your lifestyle, then you could move between two extremes of super safety first, of just buying guaranteed income via pensions and annuities, as well as having an income floor, or you could just do a straight systematic withdrawal because you have so much slack in the system because of this excess wealth that you can handle that toxic mix and still have volatile assets. How feasible the plan is and where you fall on that spectrum of I have a lot of excess assets or I'm underfunded is going to determine how big this income floor might be. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 5 years. It could be 2 years if you're really overfunded and you're comfortable with volatility. Now, let's assume it is 5 years and go a little bit more directly to your question. Does that hamper returns? Potentially. Because the assumption is if you have, and this is in my practice anyway, if you have 5 years of expected spending pre-funded in cash, well, especially now, you're still going to earn an interest rate on that. T-bills are paying close to 5% now. So you can still earn interest on all that money. It's not literally going to sit in a money market. It can be in CDs, it could be in T-bills, it could be in individual bonds. The key attribute of that cash buffer is you just want to make sure you have some guarantees that the money will be returned to you at least at the same value, but hopefully with some return from interest. Once you build that buffer, then when you're investing the rest of the money, Michael, that allows you to be more aggressive than you would have otherwise in terms of equity and other risky assets. So we're going from the income floor, which is the return of my money is important, to on the upside, it's really the return on our money that we care about. So the upside portfolio, Michael, would be likely invested much more aggressively than you would have otherwise. And it's very interesting as I've gone through this over the years with clients is if you look at the entire pie cake, it ends up being like a 60-40 allocation at the end of the day. The difference is in the accounting. You have very, very, very safe assets on one end, and you have much more aggressive assets on the other end. But together, it looks more like a traditional portfolio. And that would be called barbell approach from a portfolio construction standpoint. The reason you go through this exercise, though, is that it's not about maximizing potential returns. And this is the behavioral part. We've been focused on maximizing returns in the accumulation phase because we've had so much time and we're saving for the future. Well, in retirement, the future is now. And the standard comes from not maximizing the return on the assets as the main focus. It's still important, but it's not the main focus. The main focus is life outcomes. This is the harvesting season of life where you're using your deferred wealth to fund your life. That is critical, and you don't want to fall short. And it's so important that we're willing to sacrifice some excess return for having confidence that we can actually live the life that we want. And that's the big mental mind shift, Michael, that we have to go through. And it's really different than how we have thought of investing over the years. It's about your life. That you're not taking this money with you. And it's about, are you able to spend like you want to spend? And we can intellectually get that, but we definitely need to have the confidence that we can do that. And it's worth having less of a return statistically, or less of a return potential statistically, in order to have confidence that, yes, we can go on that trip and spend money, even though there's a bear market and inflation is high. And with a systematic withdrawal type structure where it's more optimized towards return on the investments, it's much more difficult to do that, which will cause people to deny themselves. So hopefully that unpacked it a little bit for you. And leave another message and I'll answer any follow-ups you have. So our next question comes from Mike, and it's related to spending psychology. Mike says, hey, love the podcast, loyal listener. I retired 18 months ago, and like many retirees, I'm having a problem switching from saver to spender, sort of what we were talking about. I don't want to miss out on experiences in the go-go and slow-go years, only to have lots of cash and lots of regrets in my no-go years. I was wondering what your thoughts were on this line of thinking. So the conventional wisdom would be, and this is Michael talking, is that if you have retirement savings of, say, $1.25 million, a safe withdrawal rate would be about $50,000 a year indexed each year for inflation. Well, what about changing this to, say, $75,000 a year annually, but not indexed for inflation? The real amount you have to spend will decrease by inflation each year, but encourage you to spend early in retirement while you're healthy enough to enjoy it. I've run these numbers through an online calculator, and I'm still left with a sizable amount in doing this over 30 years, and the sum could be used to make up the difference to living expenses in the shortfall. What are your thoughts on this? It's an interesting question, Michael. I am not a fan of the paradigm of withdrawal rates in thinking and planning based on average withdrawal rates. I think that's the wrong way to approach it in most cases. It's a good rule of thumb, but from an actually, how do I actually do this standpoint, I wouldn't use it. My suggestion would be that you actually plan out the sequencing of what you're trying to say. So let's assume you want to spend $75,000 early in retirement during your go-go years. My suggestion would be is start with your needs. What are the base needs for Michael and his family to live now? And put an inflation rate on that base great life. And that's going to be obviously the needs category with just some casual travel and eating out, etc. Then put a go-go extra amount. So let's assume that base amount is $75,000. Then put a go-go extra amount on top of that, say for 10 years. Let's say it's an extra $10,000 for 10 years, and then it tiers down to an extra $5,000 for the 10 years after that, and so forth. I would actually break out your spending in a couple categories. Base great life. Hey, what is it going to cost for a base great life? And then the discretionary, what can I add as go-go extra for a period of time? And then slow go extra. And start to break these goals out. Some people go even as far as, I'm going to travel at this amount every other year. I like that approach better in doing the analysis because it's more accurate to how people actually live than a simple withdrawal rate. Because there can be periods of time where your withdrawal rates are not reasonable because you have some extraordinary spending that you're doing in a few years, but then you have other income flows, say downsizing your house or an inflow from an inheritance that might come later on. And although you're higher than reasonable withdrawal in year 3 doesn't look good, it's counterbalanced by another inflow later on. It's much more bespoke than we think. So I'm not a fan of using these average rates. I would rather you build a cash flow estimate based off of the sequences between base great life, discretionary wants, and wishes. And that will give you a dashboard as well that as life gets better market-wise and say you're spending below average, you can start to add in things that maybe you couldn't get initially. But if life starts to go the other direction, you have more levers you can pull to figure out, how do I keep this thing feasible even though the slope of my wealth is going the wrong direction. That would be the way I would approach it, Michael. Mathematically, you can make these spreadsheets work like you want, but in reality, you're not going to live this way, most likely. So I'd be careful in this approach. With that, let's move on to our Bring It On segment and talk about the non-financial part of life. Bring it on. Now, you are the hero you've been waiting for, so let's go. So today we're going to talk about building energy so you can show up more as your best self. And when I think of energy, I think of Dr. Bobby Dubois, who helped us with functional health last year. You're going to be hanging out with us about once a month now, Bobby. How do you feel about that?
Sounds like fun.
All right. It is fun. So when we're thinking of what can we do proactively to show up, have the ability to show up as our best selves, you've referred to the three-legged stool. So help set the table of what we're going to talk about today.
So to rock retirement, to feel like retirement is a success, you need to have your finances in order. You need to have a reason to wake up in the morning, a purpose, and you have to have health. You have to have energy or the engine just stops. And so my hope is that we can now take a step beyond what we've already talked about, which are things like nutrition and exercise and dealing with the healthcare system, and talk about a little softer but equally as critical topic, which is our emotional, our cognitive, and our social well-being. And I'm very passionate about beginning this dialogue, and today's just a beginning, and hopefully we'll delve into each of the topics we'll mention today in much greater detail.
Oh, totally. We're going to, every month we'll come up with a little, and I think the goal in this isn't necessarily to create some massive change tomorrow, either with ourselves or with someone else. I guess a lot of it is just, number one, awareness, and then that helps change our paradigm about things so we can take little baby steps to be able to show up better.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what's the first subject that you want to talk about around this goal of being able to have that energy?
So if our goal in this sort of beginning to look at this is to be in a good place emotionally, being happy, not depressed, not anxious. Mentally, we want to stay sharp. We don't want to lose our faculties over time. And we want to have the type of relationships which are very, very satisfying. There are 4 areas that I would like to explore and just get our toes wet for today.
Okay.
The first is sleep. Sleep is critical. How much you get, how well you sleep is a critical component of achieving emotional, cognitive, and social well-being. Second, social interactions. Not only is it fun to play with your grandchild or have dinner with another couple or play pickleball with a guy friend, but having somebody that you can share difficult things with as they arise is a critical part of achieving that type of health. The next is mind-body activities. It could be meditation, could be yoga, could be qigong, a critical thing that one can do to improve that well-being. And the last is exposing ourselves to something uncomfortable, heat and cold. And what is remarkable is it's not just that meditation calms us or having dinner with a friend makes us feel good about life. These 4 areas have been shown to help people live longer and actually be healthier with less cognitive decline, fewer heart attacks, fewer strokes, lower blood pressure. It's remarkable. And these are even more powerful, oftentimes, than the drugs we take. So I'm very excited, and I think there's opportunities for everyone.
I want to pause there for a second because that's a big claim, right? That these things are just as powerful or more powerful than all the medications for high blood pressure or other things. Obviously, there are times when those are appropriate, but we seem to go to those first then before we talk about these things typically. I wonder why that is.
Well, there's a long set of things we could talk about, from the doctor only having 8 minutes with you in a typical exam time to we all look for something that's a simple fix. Yes, these seem like bold claims. And the exciting things is there's actually clinical evidence on all of these. Now, in some cases, it's quite rigorous randomized controlled trials. In other cases, it's not as rigorous, but it's highly suggestive. And so as we go through each of these, both today and in the future, I'll actually share evidence. This isn't just some woo-woo opinion. There's real evidence, and I want people to feel that this is something they can act upon.
And that's one thing I love about you, is because you have a high standard for what information you feel is valid. And I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So let's talk about each one briefly. Let's talk about sleep. Now, this actually is a target for me this year, is my sleep. I use one of those trackers. I use the Whoop. It doesn't really matter what you use. I know they're not 100% accurate, but I'm trying to get to a 90% sleep efficiency. Why is sleep so important?
Well, first, let me point out that we don't get enough of it, and then I'll sort of explain why it's so critical. 1/3 of Americans don't get enough sleep, and it's traditionally defined as 7 hours or more. So 1/3 of Americans get less than 7 hours. In the 1940s, the average was 7.9 hours. We got a lot more sleep. Today, it's about 6.8. So it's underneath that threshold that is worrisome. Okay, so it isn't just that you wake up and you feel like, God, I'm not refreshed, and maybe my mind's a little foggy for a couple of hours, and maybe I'm dragging in the afternoon. It's been shown, and again, published studies in good journals numerous times, that if you get less than 7 hours of sleep, you have a 20% higher risk of heart attack and a 30% greater risk of obesity. We all know that if you don't sleep well, you often sort of satisfy yourself by eating. So this latter one isn't surprising. And since, one of the three is emotional, social, and cognitive, a huge British study looked at people in their 50s and 60s and found that those people who were getting less than 7 hours of sleep had a 30% greater risk of dementia. So not only is it a feel-good phenomenon, it truly affects our health, and it truly affects how long we might live. And as we'll get to in future months, there are real ways that we can try to improve that.
And so you mentioned 7 hours, but what is enough sleep? Is there a standard around that or a guideline?
No, everybody's different. If you get 12 hours of sleep, you begin to say, maybe you're kind of depressed and you don't want to get out of bed in the morning. Clearly, below 7 is problematic. But whether you get 7, you get 8, you get 8.5, I don't think there's any data that, between those ranges, it makes a difference. I typically aim for 8 plus every night. I try to get it most nights, and most of the time I'm pretty successful about it.
As I became more aware of this, Bobby, because I'm working on it, because I want to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep, what I have found is I actually have to be in bed for at least 9 hours to get that sleep. It's not like I get in bed is not when I'm going to sleep. It's usually there's wake time, and it takes time to get to bed, and you're in a waking up period. So, and then if it takes 9 hours and I want to wake up at 6 a.m., you do the math. That means I'm supposed to go to bed at 9, and that's hard.
I go to bed at 9 or 9:30. So
yeah,
for me, it's easy. But for a lot of people who are night owls, they have to think about it differently.
Well, it's more of a habitual thing, right? Because traditionally we haven't done that. My wife will see me get up and start to walk to the room, and she's looking at her watch, looking at me like I'm what are you doing there, buddy? Okay, so sleep, and I've read a lot of things on that as well. So that's why sleep is important. Let's go to social interaction. How does that help us from a health and energy perspective?
This is really one of the kind of astounding things. Everybody says, look, to have meaning in your life, you want to be with other people, you want to do things for other people. But it wasn't clear that it actually connected the dots to your health and how long you lived. It turns out that satisfying social relationships, and there's a lot of definitions for that. My personal definition is, if something's truly troubling you, and perhaps in kind of a vulnerable way, do you have somebody that you can talk to? It could be a spouse, it could be a male friend, it could be a sibling, but is there somebody you can go to? Now, if you think about it a little bit more deeply, why might that help our health? Well, because getting things off our chest reduces stress. Getting empathy, giving empathy reduces stress. And it turns out that equally and maybe even more powerful than not smoking, getting exercise, having your cholesterol and blood pressure under control, to predict your health as you get older and how long you're going to live, social relationships are the one. So there's a huge study of about 300,000 people, and they found that people who did not have a satisfying relationship or series of relationships had a 22% higher risk of death. And folks who have been watching the news and reading the papers may have run across a Harvard study that has become quite talked about of late, where they looked 75 years of folks and tried to understand, why were they happy? Why did they live long? Why didn't they? It turns out the most important predictor of whether you will be healthy in your 70s or 80s, or even live to your 70s or 80s, was how satisfied you were with social relationships in your 50s.
Interesting. I like that. How satisfied, not just the relationships, but how satisfied you are with them.
Yeah, and this predicted less cognitive decline. And this is an interesting one. We all get pain. Sometimes it bothers us a lot. Sometimes it doesn't bother us so much. Those that had satisfying relationships still had pain, but it didn't bother them as much. And again, it's not a surprise, because sharing these types of struggles with other people does help you feel better. So it's wonderful. And I'm an introvert. So for me, this means work. And of late, I've been working hard to try to improve mine.
Me too. Me too. I'm an introvert as well, and struggle sometimes there. All right. Number 3 is mind-body activities. What do you mean by that?
Well, we know that the mind and the body are connected. And sometimes the body tells the mind things. Sometimes the mind tells the body things. But sort of tactically, meditation, yoga, qigong, there's a long history of this in Asia. It's becoming unbelievably more common here in the States. And just like sleep and satisfying relationships, yes, it helps us feel better. It helps us feel calmer, feel more at one with the world. But darn, it's been shown in diabetics that meditation and these types of things lower diabetics' blood sugar. And when you measure cortisol or stress hormones, they're actually down, and your blood pressure is down. And at times, the effect of these mind-body activities is even more powerful than medications. So it isn't just, I want to be a Buddhist and I want to be at one with the world and join, spiritual things when I pass on to the next world. It actually will help our health and will help us live longer. And there's more and more data to say this isn't conjecture. This is real.
So let's go to the 4th one real quick, and then I want to tie that with the one you just talked about all together with these. And that's basically exposure, we're going to call it, to heat and cold and uncomfortableness, I guess it would be. Isn't there a reason we have all these modern amenities and we keep our house around 73 degrees or whatever the temperature is?
Yeah, it makes us feel comfortable. Yes, absolutely. And a warm sweater on a cold day is great. And ice cream on a hot day is wonderful too. But the Scandinavians have been doing this thing called sauna for, a very, very long time. And they roll around in the snow sometimes. And the Russians jump into ice cold water. And, there, over the last decade or two, are a huge number of studies that's saying not only do you feel better, after I jump in an ice bath, it darn wakes me up. Well, that's not a huge surprise. But now there's increasing amounts of data that sauna, as an example, lowers your risk of heart disease, your likelihood of stroke, your overall mortality rate. And once again, cognitive decline falls by 20% in people who are regular sauna goers. Now, the cold plunge which are these tanks you can have, and we have one in our house. Or you can just take a bag of ice, toss it in the bathtub, and climb on in. These are becoming very popular now as well. And it isn't just to soak your elbow because you play too much tennis. It does something to your hormone levels. It does something to your cardiovascular system. Not as much data on cold plunge, although it's starting to look more and more promising, but very powerful. Who knows? Maybe some of it's mediated through the fact that when you do these things, you sleep better. And maybe sleep's the common factor. But all of these things are helpful. And I love when 1 + 1 = 3. Here we got 4 things. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. And gosh knows what that will add up to. But being able to focus on all 4 of these, you have a very powerful way to help you live longer and health state that will really be good for you in your retirement.
When I think of all 4 of these, and we're going to dive into each one of them and a lot of other things month to month as you and I chat together. This is a multi-factor thing. If you're doing one, you're likely doing the other. It's sort of like if you're exercising, you're likely eating a little bit better. So they start to compound, and compounding is very powerful. And when we hear these require changing our habits in some way, which is the hardest thing to do. Because we have these grooves of habits that define our life. We are our habits, right? And so what I think about is, because when you mentioned cold plunge, like my test on a cold plunge, Bobby, is, and I don't do it every day because it's uncomfortable, is the last 10 seconds of the shower. I just turn it to cold and it shocks me, especially because I take hot showers. So I sort of get 1 degree to the other. But I've been...
It's a great way to begin this journey.
Yeah. So it can be just these little baby steps of going to bed 10 minutes earlier, just not having the TV in the bedroom, just little baby steps. Bobby, I'm excited to go on this journey with you. This is how we build a great life and stack the odds in our favor. Just these little incremental things.
Well, this is great. I look forward to further dialogues and interacting with folks on what are terribly important issues about emotional well-being, our social interactions and the well-being related to that, and our cognitive function, all of which will help us live long and well.
Bring it out.
On your marks, get set.
Now we're off to set a smart sprint where you can set a little baby step you can take over the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life. In the next 7 days, choose something in the energy category. Maybe it's something Bobby and I chatted about, and try something new. It could be doing the cold shower for the last 5 seconds. It could be going to bed maybe a half hour earlier. Find one thing you can start doing to improve the sleep that you're getting and the energy you can have so you can show up as your best self every day. All right, the end of the show, I think this is the second time I'm doing this. I want to make a pledge to you as the Retirement Answer Man listener. We had a lot of decisions recently about the direction of the show, whether we're going to have advertising, whether we're going to join a big podcast network, etc. And we made a decision to keep the show focused on the core purpose of our entire organization, which is to empower people to rock retirement. So our pledge is, number one, our focus is going to be on you and your journey in this stage of life, whether you're coming up to retirement, you're in the transition, or you're retiring. We're going to focus on you and how you can actually rock it. We're going to focus on how you can have hope so you can create that inspiring goal, have that agency, and identify pathways. That's what we want to empower you to do. We're going to do this with authenticity, no pretense. We're going to be humble in our approach at it. We're going to be respectful to everyone that is on the same journey, knowing that everybody has their own idiosyncratic way of doing this. We're going to be curious. We're going to try to approach everything with fresh eyes and hold our own beliefs up for an examination to either confirm them, adjust them, or realize that maybe we were wrong. We're going to continue to work on having freedom from big finance, from products. We're not going to talk about products from money. We're not going to get paid for anything we talk about, or gimmicks. We're just going to be real. And we want to focus on action. We want you to take incremental action. We want you to expand your perspective. I'm not worried about you knowing everything about Social Security or anything in detail, beyond what you need to know to actually take action, because that's where life happens. I am all in on this. So let's do this. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance reference is historical and does not guarantee future results. All indices are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. Make sure you consult your legal, tax, or financial advisor before making any decisions.